I'm Marley Benefiel, and I'm on staff at Parents Helping Parents. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. Parents Helping Parents is doing in coordination with Morrissey Compton Educational Center in Redwood City. They're a nonprofit organization, and we'd like to partner with them because we have the common mission of helping families affected by learning differences and/or ADHD. Our topic today is executive functioning. I'm joined by Dr. Surina Basho, staff psychologist at Morrissey Compton, and expert on this topic. She's going to talk for an hour, and then we'll answer questions. Submit your questions using the Q&A bar. And this webinar will be recorded and available on the PHP website by Monday. Welcome, Surina. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Marley. I'm going to put me back on. Can everybody see me okay? All right. So I believe that you can also see my slides right now. So my name is Dr. Surina Basho, and as Marley said, we're going to talk about keys to supporting your child's EF challenges. I tried to also make pieces relevant to what we're dealing with right now with the shelter in place, which is very different than when I have students who are attending school physically. So there are different issues when a child with EF challenges is attending school physically versus now virtually. And so I am going to try to touch on that. So the title, Keys to Supporting Your Child's EF Challenges, and we're just going to start and go right into it. As Marley said earlier, Morrissey Compton, we are a nonprofit. We have been around for over 35 years in Mid-Peninsula. And we do a variety of things. Just to let you know, for those of you who are not familiar with our work, we do full neuropsych educational evaluations. We also do treatment with therapy, as well as educational therapy. We also do advocacy for families. We have summer programs, which we have up on our website now, the different programs we have. And if shelter in place is still in place over the summer, we plan to do virtual programs as much as we can. We also do free parent education, so talks such as these. We do social skill groups for kids, as well as therapy groups for children. And we also have an executive function research program, which I am the director of, where we try to do research on the profiles, the neuropsychological profiles of students with executive functioning differences, because there's not a lot of research out there on what treatments work for these students and also what their neuropsych profiles look like. All right, so we're gonna start with a short video. It's about 4 minutes long. This was co-created with one of my previous students, and he is now in college. And we both felt it was very important to get the perspective of executive functioning from the student's perspective. So I'm going to just play that now.
I was in the dark. Why couldn't I do things my peers could?
This is going to be something that's going to sort of hold me back throughout my life.
Your brain kind of just goes haywire.
Eleven,
13, 17, 19 years old.
19. Your brain is confused.
An umbrella term, which basically means that with working memory, my processing disorder, cognitive flexibility, they all kind of come together to cause me to struggle with my homework and my daily life.
Something, or you have problems with, or a difficult time with, say, planning or managing.
Yeah, when I study, it's a little bit harder for me to remember what I had during lessons and what the teacher is saying while I am listening and writing down notes.
Like, some people know when 5 or 10 minutes is up. I don't. I could go on for hours and still think that 5 minutes has gone by. Or setting something down somewhere and then going away for a minute and then not knowing where you put it.
I think about executive functioning kind of like the little parent brain inside of your brain. And it's the little brain that's telling you what you're supposed to be doing, when you're supposed to be doing it, why you're supposed to be doing it. And I think that is something that's hard for me.
Say if I'm doing my work at school, I won't know what to do first, so I'll do a bit of one, then another, then I'll forget about another thing, and it'll be this huge mess, and then I'll forget to write it down, so it's very annoying.
Mental organization, physical organization, slow processing speed, time management, cognitive inflexibility. I think that's it.
For me, I think it's about time management, planning, prioritizing. I'm not so good with the details and like double checking.
Slow processing speed and cognitive flexibility, and they kind of both play off each other, where one exacerbates the other, making it much harder for me to do work in general.
Sometimes you just want to say to teachers, like, it's not you, it's me. Like, it's not like your class is boring. It's not like you're being uninteresting, but like, I just can't pay attention right now.
If I were to tell a teacher anything, it would be to let me take my time. Let me do it step by step. I have accommodations. I have extra time. And the end goal is not to win the race the fastest. The goal is to pass and to do well and to understand and to learn.
Be patient, please. I think that it's almost sort of like a disability, not in a bad way, but it's just like, it's a difficulty. And like, sometimes when you see someone with a disability, like, you act accordingly, right? Like, if you see someone in a wheelchair, you're going to be like, okay, like, she needs a little bit more help doing this or that. But like, executive functioning difficulties are invisible. You don't see that. So you don't know that someone needs more help in that area. So like, it's easy to just judge people for not being able to do certain things.
And content.
You could figure things out.
I feel determined.
Okay, so we don't want that again. We're going to go to the next slide. But before I do move on, I really want to thank those students who were so articulate and explained their executive function differences. It is also called executive function dysfunction or executive function disorder. But I tend to refer to it executive function differences or difficulties, similar to learning disabilities using learning differences. And just so we know, it's not an official diagnosis in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is what us psychologists use to diagnose students with different areas that they have disabilities or differences in. So it's not an official diagnosis, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And so it's an area that really, again, as I said, in the research that we're trying to do is understudied, and still we're learning a lot about. So today, just to go through the agenda real quick, we're going to be refining our understanding of executive functioning, what the skills are. We're going to talk about the cognitive processes of executive functioning differences, who it affects, who it impacts, what it impacts, and then executive functioning support and strategies. And of course, when we get to that section, there are so many out there that I can only highlight a few of them. So I do put resources at the end with books to refer to and online websites that have a lot of great information as well. So let's begin. So what is executive functioning? Well, so far, there are multiple conceptualizations out there, and there's no single definition or model that any of us experts agree upon. And it's an area that even I had a doctoral student and I where we actually researched this in the research literature to see how executive functioning is defined. And even in the research literature, it was defined in multiple ways. So there is no perfect one way. However, in today's presentation, I'm going to share my model based off of my mentor, Dr. Lynn Meltzer's work as well. Usually when I work with especially educators or schools or even parents, a lot of times I hear that they feel it's an organizational issue, which definitely students with executive functioning differences have organizational issues. However, it's more than that. There are many more processes and skills that happen than just organization. So here is a definition that I use to help guide my work. And that is a more general definition for all the things that happen with executive functioning. So executive function is an umbrella term, meaning there's multiple pieces that fall under executive functioning for the cognitive processes in the brain that regulate our thoughts, our emotions, and behavior in pursuit of a goal or a task, and particularly in new or challenging situations. This has to do with our frontal lobe, and our frontal lobe is where executive function skills are mostly housed in. However, that frontal lobe definitely interacts with other parts of our brains, and so there's definitely feedback, and the executive functioning skills will help us regulate our thoughts. So how we're thinking, our perception, which we'll talk about in a bit, our emotions, how we understand things happening to us with our emotions, how we are regulating our emotions, managing our emotions. And then, of course, our behavior, which is very related to things such as doing homework, things such as doing routines, things such as learning as well. So, and the other little piece I just want to point out is particularly in new or challenging situations. So many of you parents out there are most likely seeing that your students who do have executive functioning differences are probably struggling quite a bit right now with these very abrupt changes that have happened, because it is a totally new environment right now. Our frontal lobes are made to work on new environments and new things coming at us. That is what our frontal lobes are meant to do, and our executive functioning skills are meant to do. They're meant to help us deal and adapt and manage new environments, new tasks coming at us. And when a student struggles with executive functioning differences, that's one of the hardest things for them to do, is to deal with change, to deal with new things coming into their environment. So that's very telling probably for many of your students right now, or your children, that they are most likely struggling with these changes that have happened. So what cognitive processes are involved in executive functioning? So there are many more that are defined out there, but these are typically the top 6 executive functioning processes that are involved in being able to do many things in school in terms of learning, as well as in life in terms of daily life functioning. So memory, working memory is one of them. We're going to talk about these a little bit more in detail in the next slide. Cognitive flexibility, prioritizing, organization, planning, and self-monitoring. And sometimes in different models, they also include attention. And if you look at the bottom here, I have a little asterisk that says inhibition, selective attention, and sustained attention. And attention is very much involved and very much related to executive function skills. However, I view the attention level as the lower important foundational level that we need to have in place. We need to have our attention in place, our ability to inhibit distractions, our ability to do selective attention, our ability to focus for periods of time in order to access these higher cognitive skills, which are executive function skills, such as memory, cognitive flexibility, prioritizing, and organization. So these executive function processes, just to talk about real quick what each one is, I have a very basic definition next to each of these, so you can read these. But memory has to do with working memory, usually, is what we think of when we think of executive functioning skills, which also has to do with our frontal lobes again. And that's where working memory is housed in our brain. Working memory holds onto and processes information at the same time. So when a student is doing, for instance, a math problem, what they need to do is read what the math problem is saying, hold that in their working memory for so many seconds, then access things from their long-term memory, such as their math facts or how to do subtraction or addition for elementary students, and then use that information to solve that problem right in front of them. So they're literally having to hold on to some information in their memory as well as doing processing tasks, as well as doing something at the same time. And also, working memory, as I said briefly, is very related to long-term memory, meaning what we put into our working memory, we can either work really hard to get it into our long-term memory, which we won't go into more detail how that happens today, or we put things into our working memory, and if we don't rehearse it and we don't work on repetition, then it goes outside of our working memory and we don't remember it, and it doesn't go into long-term memory. So working memory and long-term memory are very related, and many of my students with executive functioning differences also struggle with retrieving things from their long-term memory. So retrieving facts, knowledge, things that they know. Now, not every one of my students, but as I said, some of my students. The next is cognitive flexibility. Another way to say that is mental flexibility. So how a student is able to shift their approaches when they're coming up against a problem or something's not working for them, or they're not understanding something that they're trying to learn. Are they able to shift their approach and be able to be flexible in their approach and try a different way? Are they able to shift their perspectives? Many of my students are very literal and concrete in their perspectives, and they tend to be very rigid. And when I need them to shift their perspective, to look at something in a different light, they struggle with that. And then, of course, rigidity or inflexibility around behavior. So many students will engage in a certain behavior and always engage in that behavior and have a hard time shifting that behavior. And, of course, transitioning. Making transitions in real time. Many of my students who, when they were younger, reportedly their parents say that their child had a hard time at age 2 being able to shift from one activity to another. They would have a really hard time doing that independently. So cognitive flexibility really spans many, many important pieces of executive functioning skills and helps us do those skills. Prioritizing, this is what we're very familiar with, many of us, especially us adults, that we have a lot of priorities to take care of at once, especially right now with shelter in place. But prioritizing for students is about determining what to do first based on level of importance. So I have many students who literally will sit there and they have multiple assignments and they will treat them all with equal importance. They do not realize that, well, the one that's due tomorrow should be prioritized before the one that's due 3 days from now. Also prioritizing homework over maybe going and playing right now, being able to do that. Also being able to inhibit impulses or distractions, prioritizing attention, being able to sit there and say, this is, the people walking by me is not as important as me focusing right now on what my teacher is saying over the screen to me. I need to inhibit that. Also being able to prioritize main points versus non-important points in reading. Many of my students struggle with that. When they read a text, they feel every single piece is important, every detail. They're not able to glean which main point is the most important there. What is the big picture here? So that has to do with prioritizing as well. And then organization, which is typically very, very talked about in terms of executive functioning skills. So obviously organizing our physical space, our materials, our things, but also organizing our time, and just, time management could fall under prioritizing, it could fall under planning and organization. So many of these skills are related. So time management, being able to recognize estimate how much time is that going to take me, and do I have the time to do it? And have I planned out my time well to be able to accomplish all the things I want to, versus time just passing. As we saw in that video, one of the students saying, I don't know when 5 minutes or 10 minutes go by. And that affects their time management abilities. Then also organizing newly learned information. So new information, which has to do with learning every day for our students, organizing that information in your long-term memory, being able to pull that out for yourself. And then also organizing how you approach a problem. How do I solve a problem? It could be organizing your approach when doing a math problem, organizing your approach when you're going to have to write an essay, or organizing your approach for something that's happening in life that's not working for you. How do you organize your approach to solving that? And planning, thinking ahead about the future, looking ahead, and also being able to focus on the short-term time as well. So looking ahead, but also being able to look at what do I have on my plate right now, and then planning out your tasks, being able to accomplish those, and being able to plan and break down a task into actual steps. Make a plan for that task. Many of my students also struggle with that. And one of the most important ones is self-monitoring. It could also be called self-awareness. It could also be called self-tracking. It could also fall under what we call metacognition, which is thinking about your own thinking, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So being able to self-reflect, self-evaluate, self-check, track my progress. And the reason why that matters is if I can reflect on how things are going for me, then I can be aware of it and I can adjust my behavior. I can make better choices. I can adapt. Many of my students struggle with the self-monitoring, especially students, many of my students who have ADHD. So how does executive functioning impact? What does it impact? It impacts learning. It impacts very much learning. Many of my students, it does not mean that they have a learning disability necessarily, but it impacts how they take in information, how they process the information, how they retrieve the information. Social, emotional, definitely dysregulation in emotional processing. Many of my students, I need them to work with another professional or another psychologist to process their emotions, to be able to pinpoint what they are, organize how they feel so that they can make the best choices in how they respond. Perception, as you see here, is this a musician? I don't know if you can see the outline there, how it looks like a musician, and at the same time, how it looks like a woman's face. That is called perception, how you perceive information. Many of my students will literally tell me that I thought I turned that assignment in. I know I did, and they're not lying. Their perception, their memory is telling them they actually did that. They really believe it at times. Yes, sometimes they are hiding that they did not turn it in, but a lot of times the way that they perceive things, the way that they perceive time, the way that they perceive emotions can be very dysregulated. And so I have a lot of work where I work with parents to help them understand where their child is coming from. And then, of course, taking action, behavior and action, initiating in something, doing the behavior they need to do. Some of my students, they actually know what they need to do, but actually doing it is almost like a huge hurdle for them. And it's hard for them to take action. So let's talk about executive functioning differences briefly. So who struggles with executive functioning differences? So it's a very heterogeneous group. Typically in my world, in psychology and cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience, ADHD is one of the top areas that we hear of students who struggle with executive functioning differences. And I can tell you, even in my practice for many years, many students who do have executive functioning differences and ADHD tend to experience the most severe issues with executive functioning differences. They tend to be impacted even more than some of my other students who do not have ADHD. And attention and executive functioning skills are very much related. Like I said in that earlier slide, where attention is really the baseline and very important to be able to access those higher executive functioning skills. So if your attention is affected and if you have poor attention or deficits in attention, then your higher level executive function skills most likely will be impacted. Then I have many students who have learning differences with reading, writing, or math who also experience executive function differences. Some of the times it might be around one or two of those cognitive processes that I pointed out. So it might be around organization or planning only and not all the other pieces. Many students with slow processing speed, you heard that on the video that I played. Many students with slower processing speed, meaning it could be how they take in information that's slower, how they process the information could be slower, and how they produce the information could be slower. At any one of those junctions, a student could be with slower processing speed could be struggling, and that then affects their executive function skills. Students with poor working memory, which is really not talked about very much out there in the field, that students with poor working memory really struggle with executive function differences. If you're having a hard time even remembering what to do next and next, how can you even plan? How can you even keep track of time there? How do you remember what you needed to do? So you're going to start missing assignments and you're not going to be able to manage that. Many students with autism, especially on the spectrum, I work with a lot of students who are on the spectrum as well, all the way up into college level, who struggle with their executive functioning differences. I can tell you anecdotally, many of those students tend to be more rigid and have very concrete, literal understanding of things, and so they're not as cognitively flexible. And when you're not as cognitively flexible, you're not able to shift well. You're not able to reflect as well on what's not working and use that self-monitoring. So cognitive flexibility is very important, and many of my students with autism tend to struggle with that. Also, language impairments. I have students who have language impairments where organizing their language and their production of language can be difficult, as well as making sense and organizing the language that they're hearing and that they're receiving can be difficult for them. Many students with anxiety, depression, so students who have anxiety and or depression tends to trump executive function skills, meaning when a student is experiencing quite a bit of anxiety or having a depressed mood, they do not access their executive function skills well at all. And you can even imagine if you're an adult who's ever experienced anxiety or depression, think to yourself, have your executive functioning skills been strong in those moments? Has your planning been strong? Has your working memory been strong? Has your flexibility been strong? No, those things tend to shut down because our amygdala tends to take over, which is where our anxiety and moods tend to take place in the brain, where that tends to be very strong and send feedback to our frontal lobes that says, I'm not even dealing with anything, and shuts down that frontal lobe. Also, students who have multi-diagnosis. In my practice at Morrissey Compton Educational Center, I have students who have ADHD along with autism, along with a learning disability, along with anxiety and depression. So multi-diagnoses. I have students who have all of those. And you can imagine how all of those impact each other and can exacerbate their executive functioning difficulties. And just to touch on this real quick, executive function differences tend to be treated as a secondary issue, especially in schools. Even in neuropsychological reports, although I'm seeing that change now where executive function and differences are starting to be talked about more in the reports. However, because it's not an official diagnosis in the DSM, as I talked about, and also it's very comorbid with other deficits, it tends to take a back seat when we talk about intervention with schools and when we talk about neuropsych profiles. So briefly, I just want to talk about IQ and executive functioning. Some of you are probably already familiar with this, but a child's full IQ is not related significantly to their executive function ability. So you can have a child who has a very high IQ who also can struggle with executive functioning difficulties. Just like you can have a child with a very high IQ who can also have a learning difference as well. Same thing here. So I have many students in my practice, for instance, who do have very high IQs and who struggle with simple tasks of even initiating the work, simple tasks of managing their time, simple tasks of planning out what they need to do. So it is not related to their IQ executive function differences. So what are the neuropsychological profiles of students with EF challenges? So when we look at their IQ testing typically, and also other testing we do to look at their cognitive processes, a lot of the times many of my students will have slower processing speed and or working memory weaknesses. So they might have one or the other or both. Rarely have I seen instances where they don't have any processing speed or any working memory issues, but it does exist where you have some students who do not have those issues and still experience executive function differences. So I'm just going to move briefly through this part. Many of you are probably familiar with some of these things because many of your students may struggle with this. But students with EF differences may struggle with chronic missing assignments. That's one of the number one things that I see in my students, especially with ADHD issues. Or for instance, a student might have studied for the quiz, but then they get to the test or the quiz and they forget everything in that moment. Their memory fails them in that moment. They're not able to manage also the anxiety, and that takes over, so they can't remember anything. Their grades and test performance do not match their capabilities. For some of my students, they really understand the material, but that test does not reflect their ability. They get a low grade on the test, even though they understand the material, because they do not know how to approach that test effectively. Their parents report that it takes 2 to 3 times amount of time to do their homework than other students, and this has to do with that time management. It can also do with processing speed. It can also do with I do not know the time passing and I'm zoning out and my ADHD might be taking over. They get stuck or go blank when doing tasks. It could be when doing work. It could be when doing tests. They kind of stay stuck where it's like, I don't know the next step to do. They struggle with initiation. This is one of the hardest ones to help a student with, is initiating tasks, because it's different. Each task is going to affect them differently. There is not one strategy that will work for initiating every task. And so they have to learn different initiation strategies for different areas. Also, identifying main points. Instead, they focus on the obscure or non-relevant details. They don't necessarily see the perspective of the teacher or the perspective in the textbook that, oh, that's the main point I'm supposed to know. And also knowing that the main point's at the beginning of a paragraph or the end of the paragraph, not usually in the middle. They do not inherently know that. Organizing their physical materials. Of course, many parents that I work with, that I coach, and that I consult with will tell me very much about their children's rooms or the areas that they drop things everywhere, that they can't find things, that their systems do not make sense for organizing their materials, their physical space. They are inflexible in their approach to things and literal thinking. So a lot of students who have that rigidity in their thinking, in that cognitive inflexibility process, they will struggle with being able to change their thinking, to be able to understand other perspectives. They may show signs of depression or behavioral issues because of the executive functioning differences, which is very important to understand. More specifically in writing, these are some of the patterns I see. A student might struggle with initiating. A student who has executive function differences might struggle with initiating the writing process, with generating ideas for a thesis. They might get stuck and they can't think of other ideas, or they get stuck on one idea and are not willing to change their idea. They might have trouble organizing their ideas in an analytical essay. So organizing how their ideas are unfolding in an essay. Finding and identifying appropriate evidence to support their thesis. In reading comprehension, students do not retain what they have read. They might have working memory issues, and so when they read something, they do not remember what they read. They do not know how to take notes at the same time to help them remember. They do not use an organized, explicit approach to reading a textbook versus a novel. If you're reading a textbook, many times you have to have actually more attention to detail there because there's more dense information. And you might need to take more notes. When you read a novel, there's not as much dense material in there. And typically you do not need to remember every detail. So you can read it differently there. Struggle with identifying the main points from the details in reading, which I also mentioned before. In math, not showing their work. I have many students who can actually do the math in their head and then to slow themselves down and produce the work and organize the output of the work and write down all of their steps is very burdensome for them. It's not easy for them. Not remembering the steps, the next steps they need to take in solving a math problem, struggling with learning their math facts. Very big hallmark in many of my students with executive functioning differences. They get at the 4th, 5th grade, they start struggling with remembering their math facts at that point. Checking and self-monitoring their work answers. So even knowing to go back and double check their work is not something they naturally do. EF differences are on a spectrum, just like learning differences, just like even autism, there is a spectrum. I have students who might have mild executive function differences. I might have students who have moderate executive function differences, and I might have students who have very significant, severe executive functioning differences. So there is a spectrum there. And when treating students, I need to know where they're at on that spectrum to be able to give appropriate intervention and strategies. So in what grades do we see students with EF differences struggle the most? So I'm going to give you 5 seconds, not very long, but to think about what grades do we see students struggle with EF differences the most? So in schools, what grades do we see? I'll give you 5 minutes or 5 seconds. All right, 5 seconds are up. So 6th grade, 9th grade, and first year of college. So why? Because when they usually transition into middle school 6th grade, which is on the West Coast, they transition into middle school usually 6th grade, is a big difference. In elementary school, they had one teacher who organized everything for them, who scaffolded everything for them. When they get to 6th grade, you might have 7 teachers. You might have 7 different teachers assigning homework in different ways. I know many of my students right now are struggling immensely with the amount of emails, with the amount of changes that teachers are throwing at them daily about the curriculum that they're having to do right now. And to keep track of all that is extremely hard. Also in 6th grade, less scaffolding. The teachers are not going to sit there and have the time and spend the time on the basic skills. They're going to expect you to already have those skills. 9th grade, same thing. You get into 9th grade, you're going to have multiple teachers again, but now it's going to be at an even higher level with less scaffolding. You're expected to be even more independent at this level. 6th grade too, they expect independence, but 9th grade, even more. And first year of college, you go to college and it's a whole new environment. You're not having class daily. You're not having homework that's assigned per night due the next day. Some classes, yes, but a lot of classes, no. You're not having any scaffolding from the professors. You're just, unless you're at a very small school, they're not going to pay attention to you and scaffold things for you unless you advocate for yourself to make that happen. And many of my students with executive function differences do not advocate well. They do not know when to advocate for themselves. They're not aware. They don't have that self-reflection to know when to do that. Also, many of them are afraid to do that. They don't want to signal themselves and make themselves, obvious to their teachers. So they tend to hide. It's a maladaptive way, but many of these students tend to hide. Also, just to note, many teachers are not given any training in how to help a student develop their executive function skills. There are some curriculums out there. My mentor's curriculum, which is called the SMARTS curriculum, and her name is Dr. Lynn Meltzer. Her curriculum is fabulous, and it's newer, where they're trying to have teachers in every classroom teach kids these executive function skills, and not just for the kids who struggle with executive function differences, because many students who may not even have an executive function difference still need scaffolding in learning these skills. So EF interventions and strategies. Overall, I'm sorry to transition, but I know we're running short on time. So overall, the executive function intervention approach that I take, and that tends to be the most effective, is a triangle of intervention. It's where the school provides the accommodation, tries to teach executive function skills as much as possible or strategies in the classroom to the student. The home is where scaffolding of executive function skills are done at home as well as mirroring the strategies or techniques that the school is trying to teach them. And then for those students who really are struggling with their executive function differences and need extra support outside of the school, then having an educational specialist who targets and helps them develop their executive function skills and strategies. And communication between all 3 of these things around this student is so important. As much as I can when I work with the student, I am interacting with the parents, I am interacting with the teachers. The more information I can receive about that child's environments, the more that I can then pinpoint what support they need, what accommodations, what strategies they need. And then for the student themselves, helping them build metacognition and strategies over time, because they need to be the person who is learning about these things about themselves, as well as learning from others that are teaching them what to do. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this next slide, metacognition. I really believe, as well as my mentor, Dr. Lynn Meltzer, she and I both believe that metacognition is literally the foundation to building effective executive function strategies and effective executive function skills. I did a whole talk on this before, even for parents at our parent executive function conference years ago, where this is the key. You might have your child go learn a strategy, but then they don't use it. Or you might have them learn a strategy and it's not working for them and they don't change it. Metacognition is so important, which is about thinking about your own learning, thinking about your thinking, understanding how your brain thinks or how you learn or what works for you, what does not work for you. Knowing that about yourself. In all of my work with any one of my students, that is the number one place we start. I want them to start learning about themselves and learning, oh, that strategy doesn't work for you? Okay, great. Now we're going to try another strategy. Why didn't that strategy work? Why? Then we can assess why and create a better strategy. And so those are very important. Help your child understand their own learning profile and the learning strategies that work for them. So what are their strengths? What are their challenging areas? And it's okay. You should be working with your students and your children to understand that. It's a very important piece of the puzzle. So this is an example briefly about my learning profile for a high school student. I have learning strengths on the left, learning challenges on the right, and then at the bottom, what strategies work for me? It's a nice, quick one-page thing. And do I hand this to a student and say, here are your issues and you need to learn about them? No. I have worked with the child verbally around all these ideas first, and then I present it in writing later. It is too overwhelming to hand this to a student and say, learn about yourself. So one of the key things is building metacognition by using the problem-solving loop. This is, many parents say to me, what's the one strategy I need to know? I have to say to them, I'm sorry, but there's not just one. There are so many ones that are needed for these students. And sometimes also creating your own strategy is going to be the most powerful for that student, especially as they grow up into adulthood. I work with students from age 7 all the way up into adulthood with full-grown adults. And the most important thing is that they know how to problem solve things that come up for themselves. So first, they identify the problem. You identify what's not working and why is it not working. If I'm missing assignments in class, for instance, why am I missing or missing assignments? Why am I missing these? Am I not knowing the assignments I have? Am I not even knowing I have an assignment? Am I not, doing the assignment? Am I not turning in the assignment even if I've done it? Where is the problem that's leading to these missing assignments? And then explore what you can do about it. Explore what strategy we can do. Do we need to have reinforcement of checking our assignments online? Do we need support right now from the parent to help them navigate all these emails coming in, all of these different pieces? Do we need to speak with the teacher and say, there's too much information coming in, my student can't track all this information. What can we do to help them get clear on the homework they have so that they don't have a missing assignment? And then you discuss which ones make the most sense, then you do it. You then build and test the idea. You actually try it out. That's step number 4. You then build and try it out and you see if it works. That's the evaluation, step 5. I need to then sit back and reflect for myself, and somebody needs to help me reflect. Is that strategy working? Did it work? And if it didn't, I go back to step 1. I say, what part didn't work with that strategy? What do I need to do differently? So if there's one thing I can teach everybody for these parents out there is going through that thought process, going through this thinking process with your child or engaging them in that process or even guiding them through that process is so important. And that brings me to my next slides about how can you as a parent help your child develop these EF strategies with your child. So there's 3 hats that you need to wear at different times. You need to help be an observer. You need to help be a questioner where you help guide them through thinking. And you need to also help be a coach. So step 1 is to observe. First, look at which EF skills are problematic for your child. So you can look at your child and say, what areas are they struggling with the most? Now, there might be a lot of them. And what you need to do is start with the top 3 that you can identify. And then start with the top 1 of those 3, out of those 3. What's the most important? What do we need to prioritize as the most important? Is it something that has to do with school right now? Or is it something that has to do with functioning at home? So I deal with students with their learning at school and executive functioning issues, and then their behavior and functioning at home with executive functioning differences. So which one's most important and in which arena? And then starting there. For instance, an example could be getting ready in the morning, turning in their homework, having their missing assignments, losing materials and things. And so when your child is struggling with something, try to observe the process. Try to see what parts are kind of falling through the cracks. What parts are they not able to do independently? And then that's where you start. You try to identify why the process is breaking down. Then you go to step 2, guided questions. Try to help your child figure out what part of this skill is hard for them. Your child may not be able to articulate or even identify why they're struggling. This is very typical for many of my students. This is where I teach them how to learn that, where I help them identify. So if they are not able to identify themselves, I will help them identify. And one way to do that is to ask guided questions in a non-judgmental manner, neutral manner. So help them think and reflect. For example, I have questions under there as examples, guided questions. Is it hard to write down your homework or to track your homework or to check your homework? Are you having a hard time doing that? Again, staying neutral, not putting any judgment around that. Do you sometimes forget that you even have homework? Are we struggling with even remembering to check? Do you put homework in your backpack, which of course in today's world does not, equal what we're dealing with, but it could be, are you having a hard time submitting your homework online, in sending in pictures of it, and emailing your teachers that you did your homework? Are you having trouble there? Step 3, now we coach. Once you have figured out the part that is hard for your child, then you co-create a strategy. I cannot stress this enough. If you can co-create the strategy, meaning involve your child in the strategy, in thinking about why we're doing the strategy, what strategy can we use, and let's try it out. If you can involve them in that process, you will get so much more from your child. And let me tell you, this is a marathon. This is not a short-term process for these kids to learn. You will be reteaching this over and over and over to your child into young adulthood. They need that. They will need that. And that thinking that you help them learn to do is going to carry them through life, is going to help them to achieve their goals. So try to co-create. Strategy must be realistic and specific to the situation. So do I have a red folder labeled for turn in? It might be a red folder on their actual screen that says turn in, or it could be even a red note on their screen, that they post-it note that says turn in my homework. Ask a buddy in class to remind them to turn in. They could even be meeting with their friends virtually and having a turn-in time, turn in their homework at the same time. They can do that with buddies. They can also do that with guidance or reminders for themselves. And then the next step is to try the strategy and evaluate. Have your child start using the strategy. Try to evaluate, observe whether it's working or not. Ask your child to observe whether it's working or not. Ask them if they think it's working. Do you need to modify the strategy if it's not working? Or do I need to chuck that strategy and start with an entirely new one? So you can always work with the strategy you have and tweak it, or you can start with a new one. And then positive reinforcement. If the strategy is working, then provide direct positive reinforcement. Reinforcement, positive praise for using the strategy, not for the outcome only of the strategy, but for putting in the effort to use the strategy. We'll get so much. You will get so much from your child when you praise. Targeted praise is what we call it. If it's not working, then go back to step 1, go through the steps again. 1, observe. 2, identify what is not working. 3, create and use a strategy, or create and use a strategy that's already out there. 4, try to use the strategy and evaluate if it's working. And 5, provide positive reinforcement if it's working. I know I'm moving through these quickly, but you do have the handouts, so the PDF, I believe. Working on one thing at a time is key. Prioritize the most important thing your child is struggling with first. Please do not try to attack or tackle 3 things at a time. You will get nowhere. So one thing at a time, the most important thing right now, the most pressing thing right now, and one step at a time. Help them develop that one strategy at a time for the area they're struggling with. Once your child starts to succeed in that area, still give them a little bit more time to gain even more confidence in it before moving on to another challenging area. Examples of some specific EF strategies. We're going to go through these briefly. Memory, reminders for remembering. Use signs in multiple places. Do not be afraid to do that with your child. Do not be afraid to have your child do that for themselves. Put signs on their door, the bathroom, the front door, in the kitchen. One of the fun things that I tell parents and their child that they can do is if you have those whiteboard pens, you can write on the mirrors in the bathroom. One example is I had a parent who said her child was not washing his hair ever in the shower. And I knew it was probably because he was forgetting, because I knew the child and their profile. And so I said, can you write in the shower with your whiteboard pen to remind himself to do his hair, to do shampoo. And he's been doing it, because you need to target what they need and try to make it interesting, fun, if you can. Use visual reminders, pictures of things that they need to remember. You can have a whiteboard above the desk. You can have Post-it notes. You can have these chore cards. One of my parents loves the chore cards that come with Neatlings, Neatlings. I believe she found them on Amazon. She said that even her teenage daughter is willing to use them to remind them of what to do. And it creates less nagging from you. You don't have to come after them to remind them all the time. When you use these visual reminders, you can literally, if they ask you, hey, what am I supposed to do? You point and say, there you go. That tells you what to do. Or here's the reminder that we wrote out. This is what you need to do. Use physical reminders, things that they can touch and hold. Leverage technology. Many of my older students having Google Calendars, Google Keep lists, having alarms go off to remind them are so helpful for memory issues. Remembering morning routines. So the key here that I did with one of the children is to ask the child, what typically do they do in the morning if they're struggling with it? What parts are they forgetting to do? Would switching around the order help? Letting the child have choice, letting them choose the order, creating the checklist with the child, and then, of course, making it visible, having it in places that they will notice it, and then have them check it off themselves. This one is called Memory Strategy Triple Note Tote. This is more for academic information. So when a student has to remember vocabulary, if they have to do multiplication facts, the third column on the right is the most important. It's where students must create a memory strategy to jog or trigger their memory for the answers. This is a great strategy that my mentor, Dr. Lynn Meltzer, created with her team at Institute for Learning and Development, where the third column is where they create a memory strategy, a trigger to help them remember the definition, to help them remember the term. Here's an example from one of my students long ago. For multiplication tables, on that third memory jogger, if you see one of my students for 8 times 2 is saying 16, Joe Montana. Joe Montana's number was 16, I know, very long ago. And that helped the child remember what 8 times 2 equals 16. Individualized strategy notebooks. So strategy notebooks are an area where they can literally record either digitally or in a 3-ring strategy notebook or even in a notepad of what strategies are working for me. What helps me get my work done? Here's the strategy. What helps me do well on my quizzes and tests? Here's the strategy. So doing that is super important. Organization. I'm not going to go through and go through all these, but I always ask parents to think about, is this a truth or a myth? One of the top ones that I like to tell parents, being organized means things are neat, is not always accurate. I have many students where it may not look perfect, but as long as they can find where they need something, if they can find that thing or that material that they need in 30 seconds or less, that means it's organized. That means they know where it is. So organization is about being able to access what you need when you need it in real time and not having to be like, where did it go? I don't know where it went. It doesn't always have to be neat. And there is sufficient instruction at school on how to organize. I would say, as a person who goes and does professional development for many schools, no, that's not always accurate. Maybe in the grade schools, you might see that a little bit more scaffolding, but not as they grow up. Organization strategies for materials. Why do you think organizing your things is important? One size does not fit all. And the way that you approach organizing does not mean it will work for every child, meaning oh, this student said this really worked for them, so I'm going to use that too. And then your child is trying to use it and it's not working for them. Please be aware of that. Say, okay, that's not working. Why is it not working? What else do I need to do to help my child do that? Some kids do really well with color coding things, and then I have some students who hate color coding and does not work for them. Some students do well with having more space, and some students like to have some knickknacks around to be able to fidget with because that makes them be able to focus better and attend to things. Aim for finding a system that works at least 85% of the time. If that system or that strategy is working for your child 85% of the time, that is a huge win. We do not need to work 100% of the time every time. It needs to be at a level that they're functioning, that they're able to function. It does not have to be perfect. I'm going to just take one quick side note here. Many students with ADHD will try a strategy and then it will stop working for them all of a sudden, and the parents get confused. Why did it stop working? Usually what's happening is that their brain is habituating to that strategy, meaning the brain is getting used to that strategy, and it's almost like it went from the forefront of their brain to the back of their brain, and it's almost like they don't perceive it anymore. It's just not working. So what needs to happen is awareness that it stopped working, non-judgmental, neutral. It stopped working. Help the child understand that. It stopped working. Okay, so do we restart that strategy up again? Do we make a conscious effort to restart that strategy? Or do we need a whole new strategy? Do we need to introduce a new strategy to get it revved up and new to that ADHD brain, to get that ADHD brain to notice it again? And then another technique is how to get homework done. I call it crunching your time. Also, it's called the Pomodoro effect, where you have focused work periods of time that are timed, that are like 20 minutes timed. There has to be a timer there, that I work hard for 20 minutes with no distractions. I work really, really hard. And then I take a homework brain break. This is not the same as a regular break. This is a homework brain break. During homework time, it's about 3 minutes for 20 minutes, or it's about 5 minutes for 20 minutes. Or if you're going longer, it might be 10 minutes. Let me tell you, it varies for the age range of the child. A younger kid cannot go as long. They might work for 5 minutes and need a 2-minute break, and then another 5 minutes and a 2-minute break. Or if they have ADHD and there's somebody with severe ADHD, it might be they could be in college even. They work hard for 10 minutes of focus, non-distracted time. They work very hard during that time to produce information, to do the work. And then they might take a 3-minute break and then 10 minutes. Now, some students who do not have a severe ADHD could do maybe 30 minutes or an hour, and then a 10-minute break after that, but not where it's like hours on end of breaks. And the breaks need to be timed. They need to have a timer. I'm not going to go over this slide, but it has more information for you of how to make it work even better, meaning you need to change the amount of time. It could be 10 minutes to 40 minutes, depending on the child's age and attention level. The homework brain breaks. Reset your brain and re-energize for the next crunch time, for the next work period. That's the whole point of the break, by the way. It's not to get away from homework. It's to actually help your brain re-energize, to re-engage in homework. And that's very important to help your students understand. That's how you want to word it to them. Also, it has to be something that the child can walk away from when the timer goes off. So anytime I have a student and they're like, I could play video games during my 3 minutes, I'm like, I'm okay with that. Do you think you could walk away in 3 minutes when the timer's up and get back to work? Because that's what a good brain break is. If you cannot do that, then that option is not a good brain break, and you need to choose a different option. You should already have 3 options ahead of time that they can do for brain breaks, and involve the child in deciding this. This even works well for college students as well. And they have to use a timer. They cannot sit there and imagine that they can remember when 20 minutes is up or when their 3-minute break is up. If they do not use a timer, it will not work. Just real quick, because I know we're getting close on time here. I know we're at 1 o'clock. This is an example for a high school student. Where I had tracked your time, where back when before shelter in place, they were actually able to put down all their activities. And what I did with those circles there was to help them identify when they had open time to do homework. Now, I know it's a little different right now because everybody's shelter in place and their routines might be different, but still helping your child identify what time in the day is my homework time. Is it when I have study hall during the day, if one of my teachers are giving a study hall? Is it after all my classes in the afternoon? Is it in the evening? When each day do I have time to do my work? And the next is cognitive flexibility, transition, self-check, which I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but just to help them see, hey, did I transition well from that one task to the next? And if they did, they might even get a reward. They could have a marble in a jar that they get, and each marble they get, or however many marbles, they get a reward. This is really great for younger kids who struggle with transitioning, but even high school kids transitioning from one task to another, they can earn something to help themselves transition. And shifting, making it very visual. Sometimes parents tell me they do a lot of verbal and they talk to their kids and they expect their kid to shift. Sometimes that's not as helpful as doing a visual. But if you do verbal, what you want to do is give your student time to shift, your child time to shift. You go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, time to shift. You count them down. You're helping them get ready to shift. When you have a child who starts acting up when they're supposed to shift, it's that you're expecting them to shift on a dime, and that does not work for them. They need to be counted down to shift. Shifting their mindsets as they get older can be trickier. Ask your child to explain their thinking first, especially if they're a teenager or young adult. Then suggest other possible ways to approach that situation. Suggest, do not tell, do not make it authoritative. Suggest, ask them to consider. Then let it percolate, walk away, let it percolate, then check back in with them at a later time when they're not stressed and say, hey, did your approach work that you thought or not? Should we maybe try something different? So this is really the approach to take with those older kids who are resistant. 6 things to remember. I'm just going to take 1 minute to go through this. Foster metacognition in your child. Help them to understand their own thinking. Grow their strengths. Do not just focus on their challenging areas. Help remind your child of the strengths they have. Also help develop them. If they're really great at music, if they're really great at a sport, if they're really great at certain subject in school, please encourage them. Get them to work towards their strengths. Balance autonomy and support. This can be tricky, especially in adolescence when the child in grade school was used to having you help them every second. And now they're saying they can do it. They feel that, as they're developing, they're independent, but they're not ready for that yet. So there can be a push and pull there. But try to engage their frontal lobes, not just yours. Please do not be the manager only for them. Please engage their frontal lobes. Have realistic expectations for your child. Right now, with many of my parents I consult and coach with, it's helping them have realistic expectations for what is going on with their child right now and what it is taking. Your children right now are having to teach themselves, even if they're doing classes online. They have to do the heavy lifting much more than they did before. They do not have access to their teachers in real time in the class as much. It is not easy for them to access them like they used to. They now have to email. They now have to make appointments with them. They can't just walk into their classroom if they even did that in the first place. So please note that expectations are important. It takes a lot of internal effort for them to do the work and produce the work compared to their typical developing peers. Not every executive function strategy will work for every child, and this is okay. Help your child to identify what does work, what doesn't work, and be neutral about it. It's okay if it doesn't work. The more you normalize that and you help your child know that they're not doing something wrong, it's okay that that strategy doesn't work for them. But the most important thing is that we find one that works. That's the most important thing, that we persevere and we find one that works, and that will carry your child through into adulthood. Real meaningful change, please remember, takes time. As I said, one strategy at a time, one challenging area at a time. Please give them time to work on those skills. Do not expect them just to jump from one thing to the next. It does take patience. And this is just one last thing. It's a great study if you look it up. It's a Frostig Center study where they followed students with learning differences into adulthood. And the top attributes they found through research, that helped students who grew up to be successful adults, being students that achieved their goals. These were the top attributes that they had. They were self-aware, very important in their executive function skills, right? Self-awareness. They were proactive, very important for executive function skills as well. They were able to persevere, which we know every student needs. They were able to set goals. Guess what that is? Executive functioning skills. They were able to have effective support systems. That means you, their parents, the people around them that love them, who are supporting them no matter what. And they were able to emotionally cope. They had coping strategies emotionally. And as I said, many of my students struggle with that. So getting them support to learn how to cope with their emotions is very important. And it's a process. Please remember, parents, it's a process. It will ebb and flow. It will go up. It will go down. It will go up again and down. And one of my parents said to me once, sometimes you don't realize how hard they are trying inside. And I wish I could measure effort in every one of my students. I wish I had a way to measure and standardize that. So I could say that student, it took them 250% of effort just to check their homework, just to do their homework, just to turn in their homework. So please know you're not alone. Be gentle with yourself and those around you right now. And please take a break from being their frontal lobe. You know, try to let them guide them in their frontal lobe. Do not just be their frontal lobe all of the time, although you need to support them, of course, and there are times. And these are different resources, EF resources on the web that I love. I've mentioned them many times in my talks. Attitude.mag.com, fantastic, has webinars, has articles, short articles, has things for adults, things for kids, even so many things for executive functioning, especially also with understood.org, fantastic, has so much work for learning issues, attention issues, same with webinars, articles. And these are the books I would recommend for people: Executive Function Skills in Children and Adolescents, Smart but Scattered Teens, Everything Parents' Guide to Children with Executive Functioning Disorder. This one is really, really great for elementary school children and middle school, for parents of those children, and Promoting Executive Function in the Classroom. This is more for teachers, but I find parents like to read it as well. And here's our contact information for both Parents Helping Parents and Morrissey Compton. And we are available at our center. We are accepting new referrals for families in need of additional virtual academic or mental health support. Our psychologists and educational therapists are working hard to support families right now. And just to also let you know, we do really, really, really believe in scholarships, and we do have scholarships, and we, are able to do our best to support any families in need. And we do have a, Tuesday giving coming up where we're asking for donations to help our scholarship fund. And so if you can keep us in mind, that would be really great. I believe it's May 5th. Or it could be 4th. I apologize if I do not have the right time. But please keep us in mind and visit our website to be able to find out more. And here is my contact information: Surina Basho at Morrissey Compton, morecomp.org. Please feel free to email me. I do consults. I no longer have openings right now, unfortunately, for new students to work with weekly. So please contact me, though, if you have questions or if you're interested in any kind of consults or parent coaching. Thank you so much. I know we went over, and thank you for sticking in there with me, and I wish you all well.
Great. Let's move into a couple of questions. Thank you, Surina. This is such a complicated topic. I know distilling it into 60 minutes is really super hard. Okay, so here's a question. Is there executive function testing to help identify what areas are impacted? I have an older student, and I don't really have time to observe and figure this all out. I need to, spotlight what's really important.
Yes. So getting evaluations and assessments of full neuropsych evaluation can help identify areas they're struggling with. So for instance, if a student's struggling with attention issues, working memory issues, processing speed issues, can be tested, as well as planning, shifting, those can be tested as well. However, typically what I find is even doing a semi-structured interview, where I do those with many clients and consult with them, just to understand the areas that they're struggling with. I usually can dig in and figure that out that way, where I'm not doing a standardized test, but I'm actually doing, as I said, a semi-structured interview to identify the areas they're struggling with. So, for a parent, just looking at the skills they're struggling with. You may not know it's a processing speed issue. You may not know it's a working memory issue, and that's okay. But are they struggling with initiating their work? Are they struggling with time management? Are they struggling with mental flexibility? They're very rigid. Those things you can identify. And if they are, what tasks are they struggling with? Like, are they, you can also look at the task. Are they struggling? What behavior? What are they struggling with? And then start there with strategies. So you don't always have to know exactly where it's coming from. Me, as a professional psychologist that works with these kids, I need to know that so I know what to implement effectively. But also you can look at what they're struggling with in that moment. Just identify that. What is it? What task? What behavior? What are they not doing? Or what are they having a hard time doing? And you can start there and start building a strategy around that.
Great. Next question. What do executive functioning, at what age do executive functioning abilities develop? And what are the expectations for kids of different age ranges?
Oh, that's a great question. Please email me directly so I can give you more information on that. But executive functioning skills are developing from the very beginning. They look very different in a baby, in a toddler. Below age 6 or 7, I don't even work with those ages because at that point, executive functioning is about attention, shifting, working memory. It's very basic at that level. They're not doing these higher level organization planning. They do basics of it, but it's not at that higher level. So they're always developing from infancy. And there are different ages. We do not have a perfect standardized breakdown of executive function skills at different age ranges that have been researched, but there are guidelines out there. And so if you email me, I can send you those guidelines of what's expected at certain age. Typically, if you see a kid struggling with something over and over and over again, that should be the red flag to say something's not working.
Okay, next question. For executive functioning assessments, would you use the WISC-5 or the Woodcock-Johnson or other testing?
Oh, wow. Really great question. Please email me for that. It's a more in-depth conversation there. But with WISC-5, you can get at working memory issues and processing speed issues. Woodcock-Johnson can get at processing speed issues as well. And typically in our practice, I no longer do assessments, neuropsych assessments I used to, but I focus more on the intervention side now. But our other psychologists at Morrissey Compton do use both Woodcock-Johnson and the WISC. And they use multiple other tests such as the DCAFS, the Dallas-Kaplan Executive Function System, the DKEFS, 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 which is an executive functioning standardized test that psychologists are allowed to administer to get at planning, shifting, categorizing, all these other pieces.
Great. Well, that's really the end of the questions that I have. If anybody hasn't filled out the poll that's on the screen, please do that. That gives us information about how we're doing. If you're looking for more resources, follow Parents Helping Parents on social media or watch our website. We have lots of recorded trainings that are great to access during this time. And with that, I'm going to end and thank you all for your time today and really great presentations, Surina, Dr. Basho. This was a super helpful topic to have some information on. Thanks so much.